What he didn't know was that I'd been planning this moment for 7 years, ever since he told me women like me don't belong in his army. The rain drummed against the windows of Fort Braxton's officer club like artillery in the distance, each drop a reminder of the storm that had been brewing in my chest for the better part of a decade. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the women's locker room, adjusting my newly pinned Lieutenant Colonel Eagles one last time. The silver caught the fluorescent light, throwing sharp reflections across the polished concrete walls. Through the small window, I could see the parking lot filling with dress blues and evening gowns. Tonight was the annual Veterans Day Gala, and for the first time in my military career, I was attending as something other than a disappointment. The reflection staring back at me was almost unrecognizable from the uncertain second lieutenant who had walked through these same doors 7 years ago. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, 25 years old, the youngest field-grade officer in the 82nd Airborne Division. 3 combat deployments. Bronze Star with Valor. And tonight I outranked every single person who had ever told me I didn't belong, including Colonel Marcus Webb. I ran my fingers along the ribbon rack on my chest, each colored bar representing months of blood, sweat, and proving myself over and over again. The Purple Heart from Kandahar, where I'd taken shrapnel while pulling my radio operator out of a burning Humvee. The Meritorious Service Medal from my time as a company commander, where I'd turned around the worst-performing unit in the brigade. The Combat Action Badge that some old-timers still whispered women shouldn't be allowed to earn. But it was the simple cloth name tape above my right breast pocket that meant the most. Chen. The same name that had opened doors for me in some places and slammed them shut in others. The name that carried the weight of 26 years of my father's military service, and all the expectations that came with it. 7 years ago, I was Second Lieutenant Sarah Chen, fresh out of West Point with starry eyes and an unshakable belief that merit would speak louder than prejudice. I'd graduated in the top 10% of my class, earned my jump wings, completed Ranger School, one of only 12 women to do so that year, and I was ready to take on the world. Dad had been proud then. Sergeant Major Robert Chen, standing ramrod straight in his dress blues at my commissioning ceremony, his chest heavy with ribbons and the respect of every soldier who had ever served under him. He'd pinned my second lieutenant bars on my uniform with hands that only trembled slightly, and for a moment, I'd seen something in his eyes that looked like wonder. But that moment hadn't lasted long. The memory came flooding back as I checked my watch. 1,830 hours. The gala would begin in 30 minutes, and I had a reputation for arriving exactly on time. Military precision was one of the few things that had never been questioned about me. It was 3 days after my commissioning ceremony. I'd been home on leave before reporting to my first duty station at Fort Campbell, and Dad had asked me to take a walk with him around the neighborhood. The same neighborhood where I'd grown up, where kids still played Army in the backyard, and where the sound of revel from the nearby base had been my alarm clock for 18 years. We'd walked in comfortable silence for a while, past the neat rows of military housing with their perfect lawns and American flags hanging from every porch. Dad had always been a man of few words, but that evening, he seemed to be wrestling with something bigger than usual. "Sari," he'd finally said, using my childhood nickname that somehow sounded wrong coming from a man in civilian clothes who still carried himself like he was in formation. "Maybe it's time to think about other options." I'd stopped walking. "What do you mean?" He turned to face me, and I'd seen something in his expression that I'd never encountered before. Not disappointment. I knew what that looked like from the times I'd failed to meet his exacting standards. Not anger. That was reserved for the rare occasions when I'd truly screwed up. This was something else entirely. Fear. "The Army's changing," he'd said carefully, as if each word was being inspected before it left his mouth. "But not fast enough for someone like you." Someone like you. The words had hit me like a physical blow. I'd opened my mouth to argue, to ask what he meant, to demand an explanation, but he'd held up a hand. "I've been in this man's army for 26 years, Sarah. I've seen things. I know how the system works, and I know how it doesn't work. You're smart, you're capable, you've got a degree from the finest military academy in the world. You could do anything. Corporate law, consulting, government work. Why limit yourself to an institution that might not be ready for you?" The conversation had ended there. I'd been too shocked to respond, and he'd seemed relieved to have said his piece. We'd walked home in silence, and I'd spent the next 2 days of my leave replaying his words in my head, trying to understand where they'd come from. It wasn't until I arrived at Fort Campbell and met my 1st Battalion commander that I'd begun to piece it together. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison had been a study in old-school military bearing. Tall, lean, with silver hair and the kind of thousand-yard stare that came from multiple combat tours. He'd greeted me with professional courtesy, but I'd sensed something underneath the surface, a skepticism that went deeper than the usual hazing that new officers could expect. "Second Lieutenant Chen," he'd said, looking at my personnel file as if it contained a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "West Point graduate, Ranger qualified, top of your class at the officer basic course. Impressive credentials." "Thank you, sir." "Your father is Sergeant Major Robert Chen, formerly of the 3rd Infantry Division." "Yes, sir." Morrison had nodded slowly. "I knew your father. Served under Colonel Marcus Webb together in Iraq. Good soldier." Webb spoke highly of him. The mention of Colonel Webb's name had been like a bell going off in my head. I'd heard that name countless times growing up. Dad's stories were filled with references to his former commanding officer, the legendary Colonel Webb, who'd shaped his understanding of leadership and military excellence. Webb was Dad's mentor, his idol, the standard by which he measured all other officers. "Colonel Webb is a fine officer," Morrison had continued, "old school. Believes in tradition, in doing things the right way. He's spoken to me about you." My stomach had dropped. "Sir?" "He's concerned about unit cohesion, about whether someone with your background is ready for the challenges of leading soldiers in a combat environment." The words had been carefully chosen, diplomatically phrased, but the message was clear. Colonel Webb, Dad's hero, the man whose opinion carried more weight than anyone else's, didn't think I belonged. That night, I'd called Dad from my barracks room. The conversation had been brief and awkward. "How's the new assignment going?" he'd asked. "It's fine. I met Lieutenant Colonel Morrison today. He said he knew you." A pause. "Morrison's a good officer. He mentioned Colonel Webb." The pause had been longer this time. "Webb's a good man. He knows the Army." "Dad, what did you tell him about me?" "I didn't tell him anything, Sarah. But he has concerns. About women in combat roles. About whether the Army is moving too fast with integration." "And you agree with him?" It hadn't been a question. "I think," Dad had said carefully, "that there are other ways to serve your country, ways that might be easier." Easier? The word had stung more than any direct insult could have. My father, the man who had taught me that nothing worthwhile was ever easy, was telling me to choose the path of least resistance. That conversation had planted a seed that grew into something harder and more determined than anything I'd felt before. If Colonel Webb thought I wasn't ready for the challenges of military leadership, I would prove him wrong. If Dad thought I should take the easy road, I would show him exactly how much difficulty I could handle. But I'd had no idea, that night in my cramped barracks room, just how deep the resistance would run. Over the next 6 months, I'd thrown myself into my duties with a single-minded intensity that bordered on obsession. I'd volunteered for every difficult assignment, every thankless task, every opportunity to prove myself. When my company was tasked with a particularly challenging training exercise, I'd been the first to volunteer to lead it. When the battalion needed someone to liaison with local Afghan forces during our pre-deployment training, I'd step forward. But somehow, my efforts seemed to disappear into a bureaucratic void. My performance evaluations were solid but not exceptional. My recommendations for advanced training were approved but delayed. My requests for increased responsibility were acknowledged, but never acted upon. It wasn't until I'd been at Fort Campbell for 8 months that I'd understood why. I'd been working late in the battalion headquarters, finishing paperwork for an upcoming field exercise, when I'd overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had been in his office, doors slightly ajar, talking to someone whose voice I couldn't quite make out through the phone speaker. "I understand your concerns about Lieutenant Chen," Morrison had been saying, "but her performance has been exemplary. I can't justify holding her back without concrete reasons." The voice on the other end had said something I couldn't hear. "Yes, sir, I'm aware of her father's service record. and I respect Sergeant Major Chen's opinion, but I also have to consider what's best for this unit. Another pause. Unit cohesion is important, sir, but so is merit, and on merit alone, Chen has earned her place here. The conversation had continued for several more minutes, but I'd heard enough. Someone was actively working against me, using concerns about unit cohesion as a cover for more fundamental objections to my presence. And given Morrison's references to my father and his repeated use of sir, I had a pretty good idea who was on the other end of that phone call. That night, I'd made a decision that would define the next 7 years of my life. I wasn't going to quit. I wasn't going to transfer to a more suitable assignment. I was going to stay and fight, and I was going to win so decisively that no one would ever question my place in the Army again. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. It had taken me 3 months of careful research to map out the full extent of the network that was working against me. Colonel Webb wasn't just Dad's former commanding officer. He was a rising star in the Army's senior leadership, with connections throughout the officer corps and a reputation as a kingmaker for up-and-coming officers. His word carried weight at levels I'd never imagined. More importantly, he had a very specific vision of what the Army should look like, and that vision didn't include women in combat leadership roles. He'd been careful never to state this position publicly. The Army's official policies on gender integration made such statements career suicide, but his actions spoke louder than any words. Officers who supported expanded roles for women found their careers stalling. Units that showed excessive enthusiasm for gender integration faced increased scrutiny and reduced resources. And individual women who showed too much ambition or competence found themselves facing 1,000 small obstacles that were impossible to prove but devastating in their cumulative effect. I'd been naive to think that my performance alone would be enough to overcome this systematic resistance, but I'd also been underestimating my own capacity for strategic thinking. If Colonel Webb wanted to play a long game, I could play one too. If he thought that subtle pressure and bureaucratic obstacles would drive me out, he was about to learn just how stubborn a Chen could be. The first step had been to transfer to a unit outside Webb's immediate sphere of influence. It had taken 6 months of careful maneuvering, but I'd managed to secure a position with the 75th Ranger Regiment, an elite unit that prized performance above all else and had less patience for political games. The Rangers had been a revelation. For the first time since leaving West Point, I'd found myself in an environment where my gender was less important than my ability to complete the mission. It wasn't that prejudice didn't exist. Some of the older NCOs had been skeptical, and I'd faced my share of testing and hazing. But the culture of the Rangers was fundamentally meritocratic. If you could do the job, you belonged. If you couldn't, you were gone. I'd thrived there. Within 18 months, I'd been promoted to first lieutenant and given command of a platoon. Within 3 years, I'd made captain and was selected for company command. My performance reports had been stellar. My soldiers had performed exceptionally, and I'd deployed twice to Afghanistan with distinction. But even as my career flourished, I'd kept track of Colonel Webb's movements through the Army's personnel system. He'd been promoted to brigadier general, then major general. His influence had grown, and his network of protégés had spread throughout the Army's leadership structure. And I'd realized that no matter how well I performed, no matter how many promotions I earned, as long as Webb remained in a position of influence, there would always be a ceiling on what I could achieve. That was when I decided to aim higher than anyone thought possible. The Army War College had been my ticket to the senior leadership track. Getting accepted had required impeccable credentials and influential recommendations, neither of which had been easy to come by given the obstacles I'd faced. But I'd cultivated relationships with officers outside Webb's network, built a reputation based on results rather than politics, and positioned myself as exactly the kind of leader the Army needed for its future challenges. My time at the War College had been transformative. For the first time in my career, I'd been surrounded by peers who saw me as a colleague rather than an anomaly. I'd studied strategy and geopolitics, written papers on the future of warfare, and built relationships with officers who would go on to hold senior positions throughout the Army. Most importantly, I'd learned to think strategically about my own career. Every assignment, every course, every opportunity had been evaluated not just for its immediate impact, but for how it positioned me for future advancement. When I'd graduated from the War College, I'd been offered a position on the Army staff in Washington, a plum assignment that would have fast-tracked my promotion to lieutenant colonel. But I'd turned it down in favor of a battalion command position that would give me the operational experience I needed for senior leadership. The decision had puzzled some of my mentors, but I'd had a longer view in mind. I knew that Webb was scheduled to take command of the 18th Airborne Corps in 2 years, which would put him in charge of Fort Bragg and everything associated with it. And I knew that if I was going to confront the system that had tried to keep me down, I needed to do it from a position of unassailable strength. Battalion command had been everything I'd hoped for, and more. I'd inherited a unit with morale problems and performance issues, and I'd systematically transformed it into one of the most effective battalions in the division. My soldiers had trusted me, my superiors had noticed, and when the promotion list for lieutenant colonel had been released 6 months early, my name had been near the top. At 25, I was the youngest lieutenant colonel in the airborne community. The promotion had come with a choice of assignments, and I'd requested Fort Bragg without hesitation. Now, 7 years after that conversation with Dad about choosing an easier path, I was standing in the officer club at Fort Bragg, wearing the silver eagles of a lieutenant colonel, and preparing to attend a gala where I would outrank some of the same officers who had once questioned whether I belonged in the Army at all, including Major General Marcus Webb, who was scheduled to be the evening's keynote speaker. I checked my reflection one final time, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the door. The hallway outside the locker room was filled with the sound of conversation and laughter as other officers made their way toward the ballroom. I recognized most of the faces. Fort Bragg was a large base, but the officer community was relatively small, and I'd made it my business to know who was who. Some of them nodded politely as I passed. Others looked surprised to see me there, not because I wasn't invited, but because they weren't used to seeing someone my age wearing field-grade rank. A few whispered to their companions, and I caught fragments of conversation about fast-tracked promotions and political correctness. Let them talk. Tonight politics wouldn't matter. Performance would. The ballroom doors were guarded by 2 enlisted soldiers in dress blues, and I could hear the sound of a military band playing patriotic marches inside. Through the small windows in the doors, I caught a glimpse of round tables covered in white linen, each one surrounded by officers and their spouses in formal attire. I took a deep breath and pushed through the doors. The Fort Bragg Officer Club ballroom was exactly what you'd expect from a military social event. Formal but not fancy, traditional but not stuffy. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the walls, portraits of famous generals gazed down from their frames, and the American flag stood proudly at the front of the room next to the podium where Major General Webb would deliver his remarks. The room was already 3/4 full, and I could see the usual mix of military social hierarchy on display. Junior officers clustered near the back, field-grade officers occupied the middle tables, and the senior leadership held court near the front. Spouses in evening gowns added splashes of color to the sea of dark blue uniforms, and the conversation was loud enough to almost drown out the band. I paused in the doorway, scanning the room for familiar faces and potential allies. This wasn't just a social event for me, it was reconnaissance. Tonight would be my first public appearance as a lieutenant colonel, and every interaction would be analyzed and remembered by people who would influence my future assignments and opportunities. Near the front of the room, I spotted Major General Webb himself, surrounded by a circle of admirers and hangers-on. Even from a distance, he was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded attention without effort. He was listening to something that a colonel was saying, nodding seriously, and I could see the deference in the body language of everyone around him. 7 years of planning had led to this moment. 7 years of proving myself, building my reputation, and positioning myself for this confrontation. Webb had tried to derail my career before it really began, but tonight, he would have to acknowledge that his efforts had failed. More than that, he would have to salute me. I straightened my shoulders, checked my uniform one final time, and walked into my father's world, the same world that had tried to keep me out. Time to show them what someone like me could accomplish. As I moved deeper into the room, I could feel eyes following me. Some curious, some calculating, some openly skeptical. But for the first time in my military career, I didn't care about their opinions. I had the rank, the record, and the credentials to back up every step I took. Tonight the Army would finally see Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen for who she really was. Not an experiment or an exception, but a soldier who had earned her place through merit, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose. The real question was whether my father would be able to see it too. The murmur of conversation died the moment I stepped fully into the ballroom. Not completely. This wasn't a movie where record scratches and everyone freezes. But there was a noticeable dip in the ambient noise as heads turned and people registered exactly who had just walked through the doors. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, 25 years old, the youngest field grade officer in the room by at least 8 years. I had expected the attention, but I hadn't expected the specific quality of it. There was curiosity, yes, and skepticism from some quarters. But there was also something else, a kind of grudging respect that I'd never encountered before in my military career. For the first time, people weren't looking at me as an anomaly or an experiment. They were looking at me as a peer. The feeling was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I made my way toward the bar, nodding politely to officers I recognized, and accepting congratulations from a few who had the courtesy to acknowledge my recent promotion. The conversations were brief and professional. This wasn't the time or place for extended socializing, but each interaction felt like a small victory. Lieutenant Colonel Chen. The voice belonged to Brigadier General Patricia Hawkins, the Deputy Commanding General of the 18th Airborne Corps and one of the most senior women in the Army. She approached with a slight smile and an extended hand. "Congratulations on your promotion. Well deserved." "Thank you, ma'am." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the way she looked me directly in the eye. General Hawkins had a reputation as a straight shooter who had fought her own battles to reach her current position. Her approval meant something. "I've been following your career with interest," she continued. "Your performance as a battalion commander was exceptional. The turnaround you achieved with 2nd Battalion was impressive." "I had excellent soldiers, ma'am. They just needed leadership that believed in them." Hawkins nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a true commander. Tell me, what are your plans now? Staff assignment? Joint tour? The War College opened a lot of doors for you." It was a loaded question, and we both knew it. At my level, career progression required careful planning and political awareness. The wrong assignment could derail advancement just as easily as the right one could accelerate it. "I'm hoping to stay operational, ma'am. Maybe Deputy Brigade Commander, eventually Brigade Command if the opportunity presents itself." Ambitious. Her tone was neutral, but I caught the slight nod of approval. "The 18th Airborne Corps could use more officers with your perspective. Combat experience is becoming increasingly important as we face new challenges." She paused, glancing around the room as if ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. "You should know that there are people in this room who have been watching your career with interest. Not all of them supportive, if you understand my meaning." I understood perfectly. "I'm aware, ma'am." "Good. Awareness is half the battle. The other half is knowing when to fight and when to maneuver around obstacles." She studied my face for a moment. "Something tells me you've already figured that out." Before I could respond, the sound of feedback from the microphone at the front of the room cut through the conversation. A colonel I didn't recognize was tapping the mic and calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats, we'll begin this evening's program." General Hawkins extended her hand again. "Good luck, Colonel Chen. I have a feeling this evening will be more interesting than most." There was something in her tone that suggested she knew more than she was letting on, but before I could ask what she meant, she was moving toward the front tables reserved for senior leadership. I found my assigned seat at a table roughly in the middle of the room, appropriate for my rank, but not so far forward as to seem presumptuous. The table was populated with other field grade officers and their spouses, most of whom I recognized but hadn't worked with directly. "Sarah Chen," said the lieutenant colonel, sitting to my right, extending his hand. "Mike Patterson, 3rd Brigade, heard a lot about you." "Good things, I hope." "Outstanding things. Your reputation precedes you," he gestured around the table. "I think you know most everyone here." I did, at least by sight and reputation. Lieutenant Colonel Janet Rodriguez from the Sustainment Brigade, Major Tom Bradley from Division Artillery, Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Walsh from Special Troops Battalion. All solid officers, with good reputations and promising careers ahead of them. What struck me was that none of them seemed surprised to see me at their level. 3 years ago, when I was a captain, the idea of sitting at a table with lieutenant colonels would have been intimidating. Now it felt natural. "So what's the word on tonight's speaker?" asked Major Bradley as we settled into our seats. "I heard Webb's got some big announcement to make." "Probably another initiative on readiness," said Rodriguez. "Everything's about readiness these days." I kept my expression neutral, but internally my attention sharpened. An announcement from Webb could mean any number of things, but given the timing and the venue, it was likely to be significant. The lights dimmed slightly as the master of ceremonies, a full colonel from the Corps staff, took the podium. He ran through the usual acknowledgments and thank yous, recognized the various units represented in the audience, and made the standard jokes about military food and army efficiency that every military audience had heard 1,000 times before. But then his tone shifted to something more serious. "Tonight we're honored to have with us Major General Marcus Webb, Commanding General of the 18th Airborne Corps. General Webb brings over 30 years of distinguished service to his current position, including multiple combat deployments and a reputation as one of the Army's finest tactical and strategic minds." The applause was enthusiastic and genuine. Whatever my personal feelings about Webb, there was no denying his credentials or his standing within the military community. General Webb will be speaking to us tonight about the future of our Corps and some exciting developments that will affect every soldier in this room. Ladies and gentlemen, Major General Marcus Webb. Webb strode to the podium with the confidence of a man who had commanded respect for 3 decades. He was smaller than he appeared from a distance, maybe 5'10", average build. But his presence filled the room. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Thank you, Colonel Martinez. Good evening, everyone." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. When his eyes passed over my table, I felt a slight chill, as if he had picked me out specifically. But the moment passed quickly, and he continued. 37 years ago, I raised my right hand and swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. It was the proudest moment of my young life, and it began a journey that has taken me from a second lieutenant in the infantry to my current position commanding the finest airborne forces in the world. The opening was standard fare for military speeches, but Webb's delivery was compelling. He had the kind of natural charisma that made people want to listen, even when they disagreed with what he was saying. During those 37 years, I've seen our Army evolve and adapt to meet new challenges. I've watched as we've integrated new technologies, new tactics, and new types of soldiers into our ranks. Change is inevitable in any institution, and the Army is no exception. He paused again, and this time his expression grew more serious. But not all change is progress. And not all progress serves the ultimate mission of our Army, which is to fight and win our nation's wars. I felt the temperature in the room shift slightly. This wasn't going to be a typical feel-good speech about Army values and esprit de corps. Over the past decade, we've seen an increasing emphasis on social engineering within our ranks. Policies designed more to satisfy political pressure than to enhance combat effectiveness. Integration efforts that prioritize optics over outcomes. The room was completely silent now. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain where this was heading. "Don't misunderstand me," Webb continued. "I believe in equal opportunity. I believe that every American who is willing and able to serve should have that chance. But I also believe that our first responsibility is to the soldiers we lead and the missions we're asked to accomplish." My hands were clenched in my lap, but I kept my expression neutral. I could feel Patterson glancing at me from the corner of his eye, probably wondering how I was reacting to what was sounding increasingly like a veiled attack on gender integration policies. Which brings me to tonight's announcement. Webb's tone shifted, becoming more authoritative. Effective immediately, the 18th Airborne Corps will be implementing new standards for combat leadership positions. Standards based on objective performance metrics, validated through rigorous testing and applied equally to all soldiers regardless of background. A murmur ran through the room. This was unexpected. These standards will cover physical fitness, tactical proficiency, leadership under stress, and unit cohesion metrics. They will be comprehensive, measurable, and non-negotiable. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Any officer currently serving in a combat leadership position will have 6 months to meet these new standards. Those who fail to do so will be reassigned to positions more suited to their capabilities. The murmur grew louder. This wasn't just an announcement. It was a bombshell. Webb was essentially creating a mechanism to remove officers he deemed unsuitable from combat positions, using, quote, objective standards that could be tailored to achieve whatever outcomes he desired. And everyone in the room knew exactly who the primary targets would be. I want to be clear, Webb continued, his voice cutting through the growing whispers. This initiative is not directed at any individual or group. It is simply a recognition that in an era of increasing global threats, we cannot afford to let political considerations override military necessity. He let his gaze sweep the room again, and this time, when his eyes found mine, they lingered for just a moment longer than they should have. The standards will be published next week, and testing will begin immediately thereafter. I expect every leader in this Corps to embrace this initiative and demonstrate the same commitment to excellence that has always defined the 18th Airborne Corps. The applause that followed was polite, but notably less enthusiastic than what had greeted his introduction. The room felt tense, charged with the recognition that something significant had just happened. But as I sat there, listening to the scattered clapping and watching Webb's satisfied expression, I realized something that he probably hadn't intended. He had just given me exactly what I needed. For 7 years, I had been fighting against a system that used subjective evaluations and political maneuvering to limit my advancement. Webb's network had been able to block my progress by raising vague concerns about unit cohesion and leadership potential, concerns that were impossible to quantify or refute. But now he was proposing a system of objective standards, measurable criteria, specific tests and metrics that would either validate or disprove his concerns about my capabilities. It was the kind of system that favored people like me, people who had always performed well on tests, who thrived under pressure, who could prove their worth through demonstrated competence rather than political connections. Webb thought he was creating a weapon to use against officers he considered unsuitable. What he had actually done was level the playing field in a way that would work to my advantage. The rest of his speech was standard motivational fare about Army values and the importance of maintaining readiness in an uncertain world. But I barely heard it. My mind was racing, already beginning to formulate a strategy for the challenge that lay ahead. When Webb finished speaking and the applause died down, the Master of Ceremonies announced that dinner would be served shortly and invited everyone to mingle during the cocktail hour. The room erupted into conversation as officers began processing what they had just heard. "Well, that was interesting," said Patterson quietly. "Sounds like things are about to get a lot more competitive around here." "Good," said Rodriguez. "I'm tired of wondering whether my performance evaluations are based on what I've accomplished or who I know." "Easy for you to say," muttered Walsh. "You've always been in good with the brigade commander. Some of us might actually have to worry about these new standards." I listened to their conversation with half an ear, but my attention was focused on the front of the room, where Webb was surrounded by a group of senior officers. I needed to understand exactly what these new standards would entail and how they would be implemented. More importantly, I needed to understand whether this was a genuine attempt to improve combat readiness, or simply a more sophisticated version of the same systematic exclusion I had been fighting against for years. "Sarah," Patterson's voice brought me back to the conversation at our table. "What do you think about all this? You've got more combat experience than most of us." It was a loaded question, and everyone at the table was suddenly paying attention to my answer. How I responded would be analyzed and repeated throughout the officer community within hours. "I think objective standards are a good thing," I said carefully, "if they're truly objective and applied fairly to everyone." "Big if," said Bradley. "Maybe, but if they are, then the best leaders will rise to the top regardless of their background. That's what we should want in a combat organization." Rodriguez nodded approvingly, spoken like someone who's confident in her abilities. I am confident in my abilities, I said, and realized as I spoke the words that it was completely true. For the first time in my military career, I felt ready for whatever challenge came next. The conversation shifted to speculation about what the specific standards might include, but I found myself studying Webb's body language as he worked the room. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards, stopping to chat with favored subordinates and accepting congratulations on his speech from various hangers-on. But there was something else in his demeanor, a kind of anticipatory satisfaction, as if he was already envisioning the results of his new initiative. It reminded me of a chess player who had just made what he believed was a decisive move. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't the only one in the room who knew how to play chess. "Excuse me," I said to my table mates. "I think I'll get some air before dinner." I made my way toward the doors that led to the club's outdoor terrace, noting the conversations that paused as I passed and the way various officers tracked my movement. Webb's announcement had made everyone hyper-aware of the political dynamics in the room. The terrace was mostly empty, with just a few officers escaping the crowded ballroom for a few minutes of quiet conversation. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with moisture, and the lights of Fort Bragg stretched out in the distance like a constellation of military precision. I found a quiet corner and pulled out my phone, checking for messages. There was one from my executive officer, Captain Maria Santos, asking how the gala was going. Another from my father, sent earlier that afternoon. "Heard about your promotion. Proud of you. Hope tonight goes well." It was the first time he had reached out since my promotion had been announced 2 weeks ago. Brief, almost formal, but it was something. I was about to put the phone away when it buzzed with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen." "Sarah, it's General Hawkins. I hope you don't mind me calling you directly." I straightened instinctively, even though she couldn't see me. "Not at all, ma'am. How can I help you?" Quote, "I wanted to talk to you about General Webb's announcement tonight. Are you somewhere you can speak freely?" I glanced around the terrace, confirming that no one was within earshot. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. What did you think of his speech?" It was a dangerous question. Whatever I said could be repeated to Webb or used against me later. But General Hawkins had been nothing but supportive, and I sensed that this conversation was important. "I think objective standards are a positive development, ma'am, assuming they're implemented fairly." "That's a very diplomatic answer." I could hear the slight smile in her voice. "But I'm asking for your honest assessment." I took a deep breath. I think General Webb is trying to create a mechanism to remove officers he considers unsuitable while maintaining plausible deniability about his motivations. "And you think you're one of the officers he considers unsuitable?" "Yes, ma'am." There was a long pause. When Hawkins spoke again, her tone was more serious. "Sarah, I want you to know that there are people in senior leadership positions who have been watching your career with great interest. People who believe that the Army needs more officers like you, not fewer." "I appreciate that, ma'am. What I'm about to tell you stays between us for now. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." General Webb's initiative didn't come out of nowhere. He's been building support for this approach for months, arguing that combat effectiveness is being compromised by social engineering. He's convinced several influential people that dramatic action is needed. My stomach tightened. How dramatic? He's talking about reassigning up to 15% of current combat leaders based on these new standards. And he specifically mentioned that some of the most high-profile cases of integration might need to be, quote, reevaluated. The implication was clear. I wasn't just one potential target of this initiative. I was probably the primary target. "Ma'am, if I may ask, why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you're up against. And because I believe you can not only meet whatever standards he creates, but exceed them by such a margin that his entire argument falls apart." I felt a surge of gratitude mixed with determination. "What do you need me to do?" "Win," she said simply. "Win so decisively that there's no room for doubt or interpretation. Show everyone in this Corps that you're not here because of politics or social engineering, but because you're one of the best combat leaders we have." "And if I don't?" Then Webb's narrative becomes the accepted truth, and a lot of very capable officers, not just you, will find their careers derailed. She paused. No pressure. I almost laughed despite the gravity of the situation. No, ma'am, no pressure at all. You should also know that you won't be facing this alone. There are other officers who believe in merit over politics, and will be watching to ensure that the standards are applied fairly. Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've seen what he's planning to put you through. Her tone lightened slightly. But if anyone can handle it, it's you. Your record speaks for itself. The call ended, and I stood alone on the terrace, processing what I had just learned. Webb wasn't just creating obstacles for my career. He was trying to make an example of me that would discourage other women from pursuing combat leadership positions. But he had also just given me the opportunity I had been waiting for since that conversation with my father 7 years ago. A chance to prove, once and for all, that I belonged in the Army not as a token or an experiment, but as a warrior who had earned her place through merit and determination. Through the glass doors behind me, I could see the dinner service beginning. Officers were taking their seats, and Webb was being escorted to the head table like a conquering hero. I checked my reflection in the dark glass, straightened my uniform, and walked back into the ballroom. Time to show everyone what Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen was really made of. But first, I had a father to find. As I scanned the room, I spotted him near the back, sitting at a table with other senior NCOs and their spouses. He was wearing his dress blue uniform, the ribbons on his chest telling the story of 26 years of faithful service. When our eyes met across the room, I saw something in his expression that I hadn't seen in years. It looked like pride. And maybe, just maybe, it looked like he was finally ready to see his daughter as the soldier she had become, rather than the limitation he had feared she represented. Tonight had changed everything. Webb thought he was setting a trap, but he had actually created the stage for my vindication. The only question now was whether 7 years of preparation had been enough to meet whatever challenge came next. I was about to find out. 6 months. That's how long Webb had given everyone to meet his new standards. 6 months to prove we belonged in combat leadership positions, or be reassigned to what he deemed, quote, more suitable roles. For most officers, 6 months felt like a death sentence. The standards he'd published were unlike anything the Army had ever implemented. A grueling combination of physical fitness tests, tactical simulations, psychological evaluations, and something he called leadership under extreme stress scenarios that sounded more like medieval torture than professional development. For me, it felt like Christmas morning. The moment the official standards document hit my inbox, I knew Webb had overplayed his hand. He'd been so focused on creating obstacles that would be impossible for unsuitable officers to overcome that he'd forgotten something crucial about my background. I was exactly the kind of officer these standards were designed to identify. Ranger qualified, combat veteran, top graduate from the Army War College, battalion commander who had turned around a failing unit in record time. Every metric Webb had chosen to emphasize played directly to my strengths. But I also understood that simply meeting the standards wouldn't be enough. I needed to exceed them by such a significant margin that no one could claim the results were a fluke or that I'd received special treatment. I needed to demonstrate that I wasn't just qualified for combat leadership. I was exemplary. Which is why I spent the next 5 months and 3 weeks training like my life depended on it. The physical fitness component was the most straightforward. Webb had established standards that were significantly higher than the current Army physical fitness test, including events like rope climbing, obstacle courses, and load-bearing marches that hadn't been part of standard evaluations in years. The maximum scores required would have been challenging for elite special operations units, let alone regular infantry officers. I attacked it like a special operations training program, 6 days a week, sometimes twice a day, running, lifting, climbing, carrying. I hired a former Navy SEAL as a personal trainer and followed a nutrition program that would have made Olympic athletes proud. By month 3, I was in the best shape of my life. But the physical standards were just the beginning. The tactical proficiency evaluations covered everything from small unit tactics to large-scale planning exercises. Webb had assembled a team of evaluators from across the Army's Special Operations community, and the scenarios they designed were fiendishly complex. Officers would be given incomplete information, conflicting intelligence, and constantly changing parameters while being asked to make life-or-death decisions under severe time pressure. I approached it like I was preparing for a doctoral defense in military science. I studied every major battle of the last 50 years, analyzed case studies from Afghanistan and Iraq, and ran practice scenarios with my own staff until I could make tactical decisions in my sleep. I reached out to contacts from my Ranger days and War College classmates, who were now serving in special operations units, picking their brains about unconventional tactics and asymmetric warfare. The psychological evaluations were more challenging to prepare for, but I had advantages there too. The Army had been using psych evaluations for special operations selections for decades, and I'd been through several during my own career. I knew what they were looking for: mental resilience, decision-making under stress, leadership instincts, and the ability to maintain composure when everything was falling apart. But it was the leadership under extreme stress scenarios that would separate the pretenders from the genuine article. Webb had convinced the Army to construct an entire facility at Fort Bragg dedicated to these evaluations, a complex that could simulate everything from urban warfare to hostage situations to natural disasters. Officers would be placed in command of real soldiers facing real, simulated threats, with real consequences for failure. The scenarios were classified, but rumors leaked anyway. Officers who failed to achieve their objectives faced elimination. Officers who achieved their objectives but took unacceptable casualties faced elimination. Officers who achieved their objectives with minimal casualties but demonstrated poor leadership judgment faced elimination. In other words, Webb had created a system where excellence was the minimum acceptable standard. I loved it. For 5 months I lived like a monk. No social events, no recreational activities, nothing that didn't directly contribute to my preparation for the evaluations. My staff thought I'd lost my mind. My friends wondered if I was having some kind of breakdown. My father called twice a week to check on me, concern evident in his voice. But I'd never been more focused or more confident in my life. 3 weeks before the evaluations were scheduled to begin, General Hawkins requested a private meeting. We met at her quarters on Fort Bragg, away from the curious eyes and ears that seemed to be everywhere on base these days. "Sarah," she said as we sat in her living room with coffee and the kind of privacy that senior officers took for granted, "I need to prepare you for what's coming." "Ma'am?" Webb isn't planning to evaluate all eligible officers equally. He's created different tracks based on what he calls risk categories. Most officers will face the standard battery of tests. A select few will face what he's calling the, quote, enhanced evaluation protocol. My stomach dropped. Enhanced how? Longer duration, more complex scenarios, higher standards for successful completion. She paused, watching my reaction. You're in the enhanced category. I wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed still hit like a physical blow. Who else? 3 other officers, all women. All with combat experience and outstanding records. The pattern was obvious. Webb was stacking the deck, making it virtually impossible for his primary targets to succeed while allowing his preferred candidates to face more manageable challenges. "Ma'am, is this legal? Can he really create different standards for different officers?" He's justifying it by saying that officers in critical positions require more thorough evaluation. Since you're all currently serving in high-profile combat leadership roles, he claims the enhanced protocol is necessary to ensure mission readiness. And his superiors are buying this? Hawkins sighed. Some are. Others have concerns, but Webb has been building political support for this initiative for months. He's convinced a lot of senior leaders that dramatic action is necessary. I sat back in my chair, processing the implications. It wasn't enough that I had to be perfect. I had to be perfect while facing obstacles that other officers wouldn't encounter. What exactly does the enhanced protocol involve? That's classified, but I can tell you that it includes extended field exercises, multiple scenario evaluations, and peer assessments from officers who, she paused. Let's just say they haven't been selected randomly. Quote, "Great. Not only would I face harder tests, but I'd be evaluated by officers who were predisposed to find me lacking. Ma'am, why are you telling me this? What can I do about it? You can win anyway. Her voice carried the kind of quiet confidence that had made her one of the most respected officers in the Army. Webb thinks he's created an impossible challenge. What he's actually done is give you a stage to demonstrate exactly how exceptional you are. If I pass, you'll pass. The question is whether you'll pass so decisively that his entire argument collapses. She leaned forward, her expression intensely serious. Sarah, this isn't just about your career anymore. Webb has been building a coalition of officers who believe that integration has gone too far, that political correctness is undermining combat effectiveness. If his initiative succeeds, if he can remove you and the other women from combat leadership positions, it will set back gender integration in the Army by decades. The weight of that responsibility was staggering. I wasn't just fighting for my own career. I was fighting for every woman who wanted to serve in combat roles. Every soldier who believed that merit should matter more than demographics. What do you need me to do? Be yourself. Be the officer I know you are, and trust that excellence speaks louder than politics. 3 weeks later, I reported to the evaluation facility at 0500 hours on a Monday morning that felt like the first day of the rest of my life. The complex was larger than I'd expected, a cluster of buildings surrounded by training areas that could replicate almost any operational environment. I wasn't alone. The 3 other officers in the enhanced protocol had been scheduled to start their evaluations the same day, though we'd be going through different scenarios simultaneously. Captain Jennifer Walsh from the 82nd Airborne, Major Lisa Rodriguez from Special Operations Command, and Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Kim from the 3rd Infantry Division. All outstanding officers with impeccable records. All women. The first week was physical fitness and medical evaluations. Not just the standard tests, but comprehensive assessments that measured everything from cardiovascular endurance to reaction times to pain tolerance. I performed at the top of every metric, but so did the others. Webb had underestimated us if he thought we'd be eliminated by physical standards. The second week was tactical proficiency evaluations, complex scenarios that required not just military knowledge but creative problem-solving and adaptive thinking. I found myself drawing on every experience I'd had in Afghanistan, every lesson I'd learned at the War College, every conversation I'd had with special operations veterans. By the end of the week, I knew I'd excelled, but more importantly, I knew the evaluators knew it too. The third week was psychological evaluations and leadership assessments. Hours of interviews, personality tests, and scenario-based discussions designed to probe every aspect of my mental fitness for command. It was exhausting and invasive, but I'd been preparing for exactly this kind of scrutiny for months. But it was the 4th week that would determine everything. The leadership under extreme stress scenarios were unlike anything I'd experienced in my military career. Each day brought a new challenge. Commanding a platoon during a simulated urban assault, managing a humanitarian crisis in a disaster zone, leading a rescue operation behind enemy lines. The scenarios were designed to push officers to their absolute limits, forcing them to make critical decisions with incomplete information, while soldiers' lives hung in the balance. On Wednesday of that week, I faced what I later learned was considered the most challenging scenario in the entire evaluation program. I was placed in command of a company-sized element, tasked with securing a village that intelligence indicated was being used as a staging area for insurgent attacks. The scenario included civilians who might be collaborators or innocent bystanders, limited resources, conflicting orders from higher headquarters, and a timeline that made careful planning impossible. To make it even more challenging, my company included several NCOs and junior officers who had been specifically selected for their skepticism about female leadership. Their instructions, I learned later, were to follow orders but to demonstrate the kind of subtle resistance that could undermine a commander's effectiveness. For 6 hours, I maneuvered my forces through a complex urban environment, gathering intelligence, making tactical decisions, and managing personalities that ranged from supportive to openly hostile. When ambushes erupted, I adapted. When civilians complicated the mission, I improvised. When subordinates questioned my judgment, I led. By the end of the exercise, we had secured the village, neutralized the insurgent threat, and evacuated all friendly casualties with minimal collateral damage. More importantly, every soldier under my command, even the skeptics, had followed my orders without hesitation when it mattered most. The after-action review was conducted by a panel that included Webb himself, along with several other senior officers whose names I recognized from Dad's stories over the years. Webb's expression was unreadable as the exercise controllers presented their assessment. Lieutenant Colonel Chen demonstrated exceptional tactical proficiency, adaptive leadership, and sound judgment under extreme pressure, read the lead evaluator. Her unit achieved all primary objectives while maintaining soldier welfare and minimizing civilian casualties. Her leadership was characterized by clear communication, decisive action, and the ability to earn trust from subordinates who were initially resistant to her authority. Webb leaned forward slightly. What about the incident with Sergeant Martinez? My heart rate spiked. Sergeant Martinez had been one of the hostile NCOs, and there had been a moment during the exercise when he'd openly questioned one of my tactical decisions in front of other soldiers. I'd handled it by calmly explaining my reasoning while making it clear that debate time was over, but I wondered if Webb was trying to characterize it as a failure of leadership. Sergeant Martinez's initial resistance actually serves to highlight Colonel Chen's leadership effectiveness, the evaluator replied. Rather than resorting to authoritarian command tactics, she engaged with his concerns while maintaining command authority. By the end of the exercise, Martinez was one of her most effective subordinates. I risked a glance at Webb's face and saw something I'd never expected: grudging respect mixed with obvious frustration. On Friday, all 4 enhanced protocol candidates received our final evaluations in a ceremony that was attended by the senior leadership of Fort Bragg. We stood at attention in our dress uniforms while Webb read the results. Captain Walsh exceeds standards in all categories. Recommended for retention in combat leadership position. Major Rodriguez exceeds standards in all categories. Recommended for retention in combat leadership position. Lieutenant Colonel Kim exceeds standards in all categories. Recommended for retention in combat leadership position. Lieutenant Colonel Chen exceeds standards in all categories by significant margins. Recommended for immediate consideration for brigade command. The last part hit me like a thunderbolt. Brigade command would make me one of the youngest colonels in the Army, with responsibility for thousands of soldiers and a clear path to senior leadership. But more than that, it was Webb's public acknowledgement that I wasn't just qualified for combat leadership, I was exceptional at it. After the ceremony, as officers mingled and congratulations were exchanged, Webb approached me directly for the first time since the evaluation process began. Colonel Chen, he said, extending his hand, congratulations on an outstanding performance. I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the way he looked me directly in the eye. Thank you, sir. I want you to know that these evaluations were designed to identify the Army's finest combat leaders. Your performance exceeded even my expectations. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get from a man like Webb, and I recognized it as such. I appreciate that, sir. I hope this process has been valuable for the entire Corps. It has been, he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. I also want you to know that I've recommended you for the Advanced Strategic Studies program at the War College. It's typically reserved for officers being groomed for general officer positions. My mouth went dry. The Advanced Strategic Studies program was legendary. A one-year course that graduated fewer than 30 officers annually, all of whom were destined for senior leadership positions. It was the kind of opportunity that could define an entire career. Sir, I'm honored by the recommendation. You've earned it. He paused again. I hope you understand that these evaluations were never personal. They were about ensuring that the Army's combat leadership meets the highest possible standards. I understand, sir. But as he walked away, I realized that something fundamental had changed. For 7 years, Webb had represented the ceiling on my ambitions, the obstacle I needed to overcome to prove my worth. Now, he was actively opening doors for my advancement. The conversation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure came that evening. Dad had driven down from Fayetteville to attend the ceremony, and we met for dinner at a quiet restaurant off base where we could talk without interruption. He looked older than I remembered, more gray in his hair and deeper lines around his eyes. But when he looked at me across the table, I saw something I'd been waiting 7 years to see. Unqualified pride. "I owe you an apology," he said, before I could speak. "Dad, you don't." "Yes, I do." His voice carried the same authority it had when he was correcting young soldiers, but the tone was gentle. 7 years ago, I told you to consider other options because I was afraid the Army wouldn't be ready for you. I was wrong. I felt tears threatening and fought them back. You were trying to protect me. I was trying to protect myself from watching you get hurt. He reached across the table and took my hand. But what I should have done was trust that I'd raised a soldier who could handle whatever challenges came her way. We sat in silence for a moment, processing the weight of 7 years' worth of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. "Webb called me yesterday," he said finally. My eyebrows shot up. "He did?" "He wanted to tell me personally about your evaluation results and his recommendation for the Strategic Studies program," Dad smiled. "He also said something else that I thought you should know." "What?" "He said that in 37 years of military service, he'd never seen a more impressive demonstration of combat leadership. He said you didn't just meet the standards, you redefined them." The tears came then, and I didn't try to stop them. 7 years of preparation, 6 months of grueling training, 4 weeks of intense evaluation, and it all came down to this moment. My father finally seeing me as the soldier I'd always been. "I'm proud of you, Sari," he said, using my childhood nickname for the first time since my commissioning ceremony. "Not just because you succeeded, but because you never gave up. You saw an impossible challenge and decided to make it possible." "I had a good teacher," I said. "No," he replied. "You had a stubborn drill sergeant who was too set in his ways to recognize excellence when it was right in front of him. You made yourself into the leader you are today." 3 months later, I received orders assigning me to brigade command at Fort Stewart. The same week, the Army announced that the enhanced evaluation protocols developed by General Webb would be implemented corps-wide, with all combat leaders required to meet the new standards within 18 months. But the announcement included a crucial modification. The standards would be applied equally to all officers, regardless of background or current position. The enhanced protocol that had been designed to eliminate specific targets would now be the baseline expectation for everyone. Webb's attempt to create a mechanism for exclusion had instead become a tool for ensuring that only the most qualified leaders commanded America's soldiers in combat. 6 months later, I was promoted to colonel at age 26, making me the youngest brigade commander in the Army. The promotion ceremony was held at Fort Stewart, with General Hawkins presiding and my father standing proudly in the front row. In my remarks after receiving my Eagles, I thanked the soldiers who had served under my command, the mentors who had guided my development, and the family who had supported my dreams even when they feared for my future. But I also said something that I'd been waiting 7 years to say publicly. Excellence has no gender, no background, no political affiliation. Excellence is demonstrated through performance, proven through results, and recognized by those who understand what true leadership looks like. The Army is strongest when it embraces excellence wherever it's found, and gives every soldier the opportunity to reach their full potential. After the ceremony, as officers and their families mingled at the reception, Webb approached me one final time. He was scheduled to retire in 6 months, his distinguished career capped by reforms that had strengthened the Army's leadership standards across the board. "Colonel Chen," he said, offering his hand, "I wanted to congratulate you on your promotion and wish you success in your new command." "Thank you, sir." I also wanted to say something else. He paused, and for a moment the confident general I'd known for 7 years seemed uncertain. "I spent a lot of years believing that tradition and change were incompatible, that preserving what was best about the Army meant resisting what was new. You taught me that the best traditions aren't about excluding people. They're about including everyone who's willing to uphold the highest standards." Quote, "It was the closest thing to a full apology I would ever receive, and it was enough. Sir, the Army needs leaders who are willing to question their assumptions and adapt to new realities. That's what you did with the evaluation protocols." He smiled. "What I did was try to prove a point and end up proving the opposite one instead, but I'm glad I was wrong." As he walked away for the last time, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 7 years ago, I'd been a second lieutenant with something to prove. Today, I was a colonel with soldiers to lead and a future to build. The Army hadn't changed because of me. It had changed because excellence demanded it. But I'd been privileged to be part of that change, to help prove that merit matters more than demographics, and that the best leaders emerge when artificial barriers are removed. That evening, I called my father from my new quarters at Fort Stewart. "How does it feel to outrank my old commander?" he asked with a chuckle. I thought about the question seriously. "It feels like justice," I said finally. Not because I needed to prove anything to him, but because every soldier deserves leaders who earned their positions through competence and character. "And how does it feel to know you'll probably be wearing stars before you're 30? I smiled, looking out the window at the soldiers of my new brigade conducting evening training exercises. "It feels like responsibility. And it feels like just the beginning." 7 years ago, my father had told me that women like me didn't belong in his army. Tonight, as Colonel Sarah Chen, I commanded 3,000 soldiers in an army that had learned to recognize excellence regardless of who demonstrated it. The best part wasn't that I'd proven the doubters wrong. The best part was that I'd helped create an army where the next generation of leaders would never face the same doubts at all. Excellence had won, and America's soldiers were stronger for it. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't about defeating your enemies. They're about turning them into allies who recognize that they were fighting for the wrong side all along. My father had been right about one thing 7 years ago. The Army wasn't ready for someone like me. But that wasn't a reason to quit. It was a reason to make the Army better. And that's exactly what we did.